Hello, my dear friends. They called it medicine, but it worked like a curse, a white pill so small it could disappear on your tongue, yet powerful enough to bend empires, ruin families, and reshape the human soul. For 2,000 years, the world has tried to control this flower, but each time it only learned to hide better, changing colour, form, and name. Beneath every bottle, every promise of relief, lies the same old poison wearing a new disguise. Tonight, let's walk together through the story of how opium began as a cure and ended as humanity's most elegant self-destruction. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to wander through the early fields of Mesopotamia or the valleys of Egypt, the sight of pale blossoms swaying under the sun would seem peaceful. The poppy, with its white and lilac petals, was not yet a symbol of addiction or empire, but a quiet companion to ancient healers. Its sap, thick and milky, was collected at dawn from the small green pods, dried in the warmth of the air. It hardened into a substance that seemed almost magical. It soothed pain, calmed nerves, and brought sleep when sleep would not come. In a time when medicine was still guesswork and prayer, the plant appeared to be a gift from the gods. Temples stored it as sacred, and physicians praised its power to comfort the dying and the sick. The line between healing and mystery was thin, and the poppy rested comfortably between them. It is strangely poetic that humanity's oldest medicine would one day become its most seductive poison. In Egypt, poppies grew along the Nile, where the soil was rich and the air carried dust from faraway deserts. Their petals fell quickly, but their pods were treasured. The poppy sap was mixed with wine or honey and offered to those in pain. Some used it to ease childbirth, others to still the cries of infants through the night. Relief was valued more than caution, and the plant became part of ritual and routine. Clay tablets and scrolls recorded its use, and every healer learned the method of slicing the pod just enough to let the white liquid bleed out. To the Egyptians, it was a blessing. To the Greeks who came later, it was a divine mystery. They named it Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing flower. The name alone was enough to inspire awe. Its effect was soft, almost holy, turning pain into peace and wakefulness into oblivion. In ancient texts, the poppy appeared beside other great plants of healing. It was mentioned by Hippocrates, by Dioscorides, and by Galen, all speaking of its virtue in quieting the body and mind, but none could see the shadow behind its light. The poppy did not simply end pain, it erased it, along with the sharpness of thought that came with it. Those who tasted too much slipped not into rest, but into depths from which they did not return. Yet people kept harvesting it, grinding it, and sharing it across kingdoms. The beauty of the flower and the sweetness of its scent blinded them to its danger. If it were sold in our time, it would be displayed like a miracle plant in health shops, promising calmness and sleep, though hiding the same quiet peril beneath. From the Fertile Crescent to the coasts of India, the cultivation spread with merchants and sailors. The plant required little care, yet offered great reward. Empires grew rich from it without yet knowing what they carried. In some lands, priests burned poppy resin during funerals, believing the smoke carried prayers to the afterlife. In others, it was placed in the hands of the dead to ensure a peaceful passage. The poppy was everywhere, as medicine, an offering, and an ornament. Fields of them shimmered like frost under the sun, and harvesters bent low to slice each pod before the heat thickened the sap. The fragrance lingered faintly in the air, soft and earthy. the smell of something both sacred and dangerous. To the people of those times, pain was a constant part of life. There were no anesthetics, no gentle cures, only herbs and chants. The poppy seemed to offer mercy. A few drops of its sap could silence agony, and so it earned its place beside altars and within apothecaries. It was said to bring dreams, and perhaps that was true. Sleep came swiftly to those who took it, though not all awoke again. The balance between remedy and ruin depended only on how much one took. I can almost understand their trust, seeing a field of flowers glowing white under the sun and believing something so pure could not harm them. The ancient healers spoke softly of its limits, but still relied on it daily. They crushed it, mixed it, and prescribed it to kings and peasants alike. In their records, the warnings were few, the praise abundant. For centuries, the poppy remained a plant of comfort and faith, its danger forgotten with each generation. The illusion of control is perhaps the oldest lie in medicine. People believed they could use the flower without being used by it. They were wrong. As centuries passed, the plant became part of trade, travelling in sacks with spices and incense, its seeds scattered across continents, taking root wherever soil was kind and human curiosity endless. The world embraced it without question. There was no greed yet, no empire built on addiction, only the steady rhythm of human need and ignorance repeating itself. The poppy offered peace, and humanity accepted the bargain without reading the terms. The image of those early fields remains almost innocent. Rows of flowers glimmering beneath the sky, farmers scraping resin into bowls, unaware that they were collecting the foundation of wars yet to come. The plant that promised rest would one day bring ruin. But in that moment, it was still pure. Its story had only just begun, and no one could have guessed how far its influence would spread or how deeply it would root itself into human desire. The poppy was more than a plant. It was a mirror reflecting both our need for comfort and our blindness to consequence. What began as medicine would evolve into empire, crime, and corruption. And like the soft sap that leaked from its pods, its influence would seep quietly through every layer of civilization. The gentle flower of the East had already begun its long journey toward power and destruction. Its beauty deceived the wise, its comfort trapped the faithful, and its legacy had yet to reveal its full weight. The seeds of empire were already sown, hidden in the white petals of a simple flower. The poppy began as mercy and ended as a weapon. From fields of healing, it would travel into the hands of merchants and kings. Somewhere in that passage from medicine to trade, something sacred would be lost, and something terrible would be born. The earliest healers understood pain as both a curse and a test. They had few tools and fewer certainties. Among their jars of powders and oils stood one that seemed to quiet every suffering. The sap of the poppy, dark when dried, was mixed into drinks, ointments, and incense. It softened pain, calmed fever, and hushed the cries of the dying. In ancient Egypt, physicians crushed it with honey or dates and gave it to those tormented by illness. Relief came quickly, and for that, the plant was revered. The sick slept deeply. The mothers in childbirth found silence between contractions, and the dying passed more gently. To those who used it, the poppy's power felt divine, a bridge between agony and peace. It is darkly amusing that the very medicine that eased humanity's first pains would one day cause so many of them. The Greeks studied the same substance centuries later, refining its use through observation and trial. Hippocrates wrote of its power to still coughs and dull pain. To him, it was one ingredient among many, a part of the natural order that could restore balance when used with reason. The physicians who came after him disagreed on dosage but not on faith. They prescribed it to kings and beggars alike, believing they held mastery over its effects. Temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, stored poppy mixtures for pilgrims seeking rest. The idea of a plant that could soothe both body and spirit suited a culture obsessed with moderation and harmony. The poppy seemed to offer both, but moderation, as always, was easier to preach than to practice. Across Asia, trade carried the plant eastward. In China, it entered medicine quietly, folded into herbal formulas that promised longevity and calm. Physicians used it for stomach pain, coughing, and sleeplessness. They called it a helper, not a master. Mixed with ginseng or licorice, it seemed harmless. Another piece of the great puzzle of balance. It fit neatly into a philosophy that viewed the body as a landscape to be tended, not conquered. Yet even here, beneath the discipline of traditional medicine, the seeds of dependence were taking root. Patients returned again and again, chasing relief that never lasted. The healers noted it, but few understood why. If the same plant appeared in modern pharmacies, it would probably be bottled with a label promising natural calm, sitting beside herbal teas and lavender oils. The pattern has not changed, only the packaging. The more medicine evolved, the more the poppy followed. It survived centuries of progress because it worked. Where other remedies failed, this one succeeded, even if the success was dangerous. Ancient healers saw only results: a quiet patient, a slowed heartbeat, a still body. There were no microscopes or chemical tests to reveal what the substance did inside the blood. What they knew was practical and immediate. It worked quickly, and so they used it endlessly. The human desire to stop pain was older than reason, and the poppy was reason's easier surrender. In the temples of Thebes and the clinics of Athens, in the courtyards of Chinese apothecaries, the same scenes repeated. Small bowls of dark resin were stirred into liquid, poured into cups, and handed to the suffering. No one thought of side effects. No one imagined what would happen if the medicine was taken too often. Those who recovered praised it. Those who didn't were too quiet to warn anyone. Something is chilling about how easy it is to mistake relief for safety. People believed the plant healed because they wanted it to. Pain was the enemy, and the poppy was victory. Over time, myths grew around its origin. Some said it was born from the tears of gods, others that it sprouted where soldiers had fallen in battle. These stories were not about truth, but comfort. They gave divine approval to a habit that had already taken hold. It was easier to bless the poppy than to fear it. Ancient physicians, armed with philosophy and ritual, believed they controlled it. In reality, they had only opened the door to something they could never close. What began as a miracle of nature was quietly becoming a necessity of daily life. By the time the poppy's sap reached the Roman Empire, it was indispensable. Surgeons used it before amputations, priests used it in ceremonies, and housewives mixed it with wine for restless children. Every class, every trade, every household found a place for it. Rome expanded, and so did the trade in dried poppy pods. The empire believed itself immortal, yet it depended on a plant that blurred the line between life and death. The poppy was no longer sacred, it was practical, and practicality is often the first disguise of dependence. Medicine recorded its miracles but ignored its ghosts. For every patient eased, another slipped too far into its sleep. The healers who had once praised it as divine began to whisper of its darker side. Though they still used it, pain demanded obedience, and the poppy provided it. It became the silent partner in the progress of civilization. Every new empire would rediscover it, convinced they had mastered it, only to learn the same quiet lesson. The history of its medical use is not a story of evil, but of ignorance. The ancients were not reckless. They were human. They believed in what worked and questioned little beyond that. The poppy fit perfectly into their world, beautiful, useful, and deceptive. Its comfort came too easily to refuse. The flower that had once been a sacred remedy was becoming a habit disguised as care. The line between doctor and supplier had already blurred, and the plant's reputation as a healer hid its true power. Humanity had learned to rely on it, and that dependence would soon shape the course of empires. The gift of the poppy was never free. It offered rest, but demanded obedience. In the hands of those who sought only to heal, it seemed a miracle. In the hands of those who sought profit, it would become something far worse. Opium's role in ancient medicine showed both the brilliance and the blindness of early civilizations. It began as mercy and ended as a need that could not be undone. As trade expanded and cultures collided, the plant would escape the temples and enter the markets. Its transformation from cure to commodity was about to begin. In many ancient temples, the air was thick with smoke and silence. Priests stood before altars where bowls of poppy resin burned slowly, releasing a sweet, heavy scent that clung to skin and cloth. The fragrance was said to open the gates between the living and the divine. It lulled minds into a quiet drifting, where visions came easily and reason faded like mist. In those dim sanctuaries, the poppy was not a medicine but a key. It promised revelation, prophecy, and the illusion of communion with gods. To inhale its smoke was to touch another world, if only for a moment. It is oddly fitting that people once believed enlightenment could come from a plant that simply dulled the senses. In Mesopotamia, the priests called it the plant of joy. Offerings of opium were laid beside carved idols, its smoke believed to carry prayers into the unseen. Rituals stretched through the night, worshippers swaying, their eyes half closed, their bodies trembling in rhythm with the chant. Some saw shapes in the smoke, faces of ancestors or spirits that whispered promises. The poppy blurred the line between vision and dream. The ancient world accepted that boundary as sacred. What today would be called hallucination was then considered a message from beyond. The same belief followed the plant wherever it spread. In Egypt, poppy resin was mixed with wine for funeral rites. Families gave it to the dying, helping their souls drift gently into the afterlife. Mourners burned it beside tombs, so the scent would guide the departed through darkness. The air inside the burial chambers carried traces of its smoke, faint but unmistakable even centuries later. To ancient eyes, this was mercy. The poppy was the breath of transition, the bridge between suffering and serenity. If such a ritual happened today, it would probably be framed as therapy, a way to manage grief through chemical calm rather than prayer. In Greece, the priests of Demeter carried wreaths of poppy flowers during the mysteries of Eleusis. Initiates drank dark infusions that clouded their minds and filled them with visions of life, death, and rebirth. They believed they had seen eternity. The poppy became a symbol of divine sleep, of forgetfulness, of crossing from one realm to another. The goddess herself was depicted holding her pods, serene and unblinking. Few questioned the nature of the visions. The boundary between chemical and spiritual was not yet known, and those who sought meaning were grateful for any glimpse of it. Farther east, in India and China, holy men inhaled the smoke during meditation. It quieted hunger, slowed the heartbeat, and made long hours of prayer bearable. Some claimed it brought clarity, others said it erased thought entirely. Both were considered forms of enlightenment, in small mountain shrines. The air shimmered faintly from the heat of oil lamps and the burn of poppy resin. Monks sat motionless, eyes unfocused, the world narrowing to breath and silence. What they experienced was not wisdom, but they believed it was. The human mind, when softened, can mistake stillness for truth. There is something both tragic and human in the way people seek meaning through oblivion. The use of opium in rituals was not always solemn. In some places, it became a spectacle. Dancers moved in clouds of fragrant smoke, their bodies limber and languid, their smiles vacant. Audiences mistook their slow grace for divine possession. The line between performance and prayer disappeared. In royal courts, priests and rulers alike consumed the drug before making decisions, convinced it cleared the path to wisdom. It did not. It only numbed the noise of uncertainty, replacing it with quiet confidence that felt like revelation. The poppy did not speak. It was silenced, and silence, to those desperate for answers, was mistaken for the voice of the gods. As trade expanded, so did the rituals. Caravans carried not just resin, but belief. The idea that opium connected the mortal to the eternal. Merchants sold both the substance and the story. Across deserts and seas, the myth remained unchanged that within this flower lay the power to transcend pain and reach the divine. No one called it addiction, not yet. They called it devotion. People sought the same peace priests once promised, though fewer remembered the prayers that accompanied it. The poppy's role in faith revealed as much about humanity as it did about the plant. Every culture that discovered it found in it a reflection of its fears and desires. To some, it was holy sleep. To others, a gateway to prophecy. But underneath the robes, incense, and ceremony, the same truth pulsed. It was not God speaking through the smoke. It was the human brain, numbed and dreaming, convincing itself that the darkness had meaning. When the effects faded, the worshippers awoke in confusion, reaching again for the resin that had promised transcendence. The cycle of faith and dependency was already forming, hidden beneath sacred words. In time, the poppy left the temples and entered ordinary homes. Families burned it at night to keep away spirits, or so they said. In truth, they longed for its warmth, its stillness, its forgetfulness. The plant that had once belonged to priests became the comfort of the common. From altars to hearths, it offered the same promise to quiet the mind, to soften reality. Few noticed that they were praying to the same god by another name. The ancient ritual survived in fragments, rewritten and reinterpreted through the centuries, but their essence never changed. Humanity has always tried to meet the divine halfway, and the poppy provided the illusion of progress. To dream was easier than to understand. The smoke that once filled temples now filled houses and, later, entire nations. It no longer carried prayers upward. It hung low, clinging to walls, seeping into lungs. What had begun as worship had become dependence dressed in ritual. The flower that once crowned the heads of priestesses now crowned graves. Its meaning shifted from sacred to sorrowful, but its presence remained constant. The gods were silent, yet people kept burning, drinking, and inhaling, hoping the old magic still worked. The truth was simpler. They were chasing the same sleep that had always been mistaken for peace. Opium in religious rites revealed humanity's longing for control over the uncontrollable. Through smoke and ceremony, people sought connection and found only escape. The plant that once stood for prayer would soon become the language of trade, its holiness stripped, its price measured not in faith but in gold. In the stillness of ancient funerals, opium drifted through the air like a quiet farewell, the thick, sweet scent of burning resin mixed with incense, clinging to the walls of tombs and the robes of mourners. Those gathered around the dying offered it not as medicine, but as mercy. Drops of poppy sap were pressed between pale lips, easing breath and dulling pain. The goal was not recovery, but surrender. Death, when touched by opium, appeared softer, less cruel. The boundary between sleep and silence blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. It is a strange tenderness to comfort the dying with the same substance that hastened their end. Across civilizations, this practice grew quietly, unchallenged. In Egypt, priests rubbed poppy mixtures onto the tongues of the condemned, believing it guided the spirit gently from the body. The dying smiled faintly as their hearts slowed, their faces serene as if drifting into a dream. In Greece, families lit small lamps filled with oil and poppy resin beside the bed of the dying. The flame flickered low, and the scent filled the room. It was said to ease fear and open the gates to eternity. No one called it poisoning. They called it peace. The poppy transformed agony into tranquility, and in doing so, disguised death as rest. To those who watched their loved ones fade, the plant offered comfort that faith alone could not. It silenced the body's protest, quieted the gasping, and replaced horror with stillness. The illusion of a calm death soothed the living more than the dying. The rituals around it became sacred acts, repeated for centuries. When the final moments came, opium was there, at the bedside, on the lips, in the air. If the same practice were used today, it would likely be wrapped in medical language, called sedation or palliative care, and still defended as compassion. The concept of the eternal sleep was born in these moments. People began to associate death not with violence or fear, but with the soft descent into oblivion that opium made possible. Art and literature embraced the symbol. The poppy became an emblem of rest, its petals decorating tombs and funerary masks. Its beauty masked its truth. What it offered was not transcendence but escape. The human desire to make death gentle blinded people to the cost of that gentleness. In temples, opium was offered to the recently deceased as part of burial rites. Priests anointed the bodies with oils laced with poppy resin, believing the soul would travel more peacefully. The air inside the catacombs and crypts was thick with its odour. It mixed with the smoke of myrrh and frankincense, saturating the atmosphere until the living could barely stay conscious. Mourners whispered prayers they would not remember, their grief dulled into numb acceptance. The poppy did what time could not. It made loss tolerable. I cannot decide which is more unsettling, the idea of using poison to comfort the dying, or the ease with which people learned to see it as kindness. As the practice spread, it evolved into a ritual. In Mesopotamia, it was believed that spirits who lingered in pain could not cross to the afterlife. Families would burn poppy resin at the door, hoping the fragrance would lure the soul away. In China, mixtures of opium and herbs were poured into cups for the dying to drink before their final sleep. Physicians oversaw the act with solemn calm, recording pulse and breath until both disappeared. Death became predictable, even manageable. The illusion of control brought strange satisfaction. The symbolism deepened over time. Poets wrote of poppy fields as gateways to eternity. Painters depicted death as a gentle figure crowned with white flowers. What once was a simple plant became a metaphor for surrender. The more it was used, the less it frightened people. They began to see death not as an end, but as a release, a sleep that erased suffering. The poppy, in its quiet way, rewrote humanity's relationship with mortality. No sword or sermon had ever done so much to change the face of death. Even in societies that forbade indulgence, opium was tolerated in death. Religious leaders condemned excess in life but made exceptions for the dying. To deny comfort in those final moments seemed cruel. That mercy, repeated across generations, normalized the poison. Death with opium became the ideal death calm, graceful, almost beautiful. People feared pain more than death itself, and opium made that trade acceptable. There were stories of rulers who demanded to die under its influence. Their servants crushed poppy pods into wine, poured it into golden cups, and watched as the monarch slipped quietly away. Some were buried with jars of the same resin, in case their journey required more sleep beyond the grave. The flower had conquered not only pain but dignity. To die without its comfort was seen as unfortunate, even barbaric. The more people embraced opium in death, the more they welcomed it in life. Families kept small jars of resin not just for illness, but for old age and grief. It became a companion to both birth and burial, circling through generations like a quiet inheritance. The line between medicine, ritual, and dependence was gone. Every civilization that used it believed it had mastered it. None truly had. In the end, the poppy's presence in funerals and final breaths revealed something essential about humanity. People will do anything to make suffering disappear, even if it means embracing the very thing that destroys them. To the dying, opium offered rest. To the living, It offered the illusion of control. Both found solace in its lie. The ancient world built its understanding of death on that illusion. The flower's soft petals and milky sap became symbols of peace, but beneath them lay indifference, a willingness to trade truth for comfort. The poppy did not conquer death. It merely taught people how to surrender beautifully. Opium's role in easing death blurred the line between mercy and denial. It made endings seem gentle, disguising despair as peace. From that illusion of kindness would rise a much larger deception, one that turned comfort into commerce and began to feed on the living instead of the dead. Caravans once moved slowly across the deserts, their camels heavy with silk, spices, and small clay jars sealed with wax. Inside those jars lay a powder that traders called sleep dust, though it was known by many names. The Arabs had learned their value from ancient healers, and they carried it west with the same care given to gold. At first, opium was a curiosity, a gift for kings and physicians along the Mediterranean coast. Merchants presented it as both medicine and mystery, telling stories of its power to calm storms inside the body. Buyers listened, intrigued and trusting, never asking how such peace was made. It is almost comical how easily a poison travels when wrapped in the language of healing. As the trade routes expanded, the jars multiplied. Ships from Alexandria and Damascus carried poppy resin across the sea, packed between crates of incense and textiles. When the lids were opened in Venice or Genoa, the smell was faintly sweet, almost pleasant. Apothecaries bought it eagerly, grinding the resin into powders or pressing it into pills. They sold it as a cure for coughs, fevers, and heartbreak. There were no questions about purity or dosage. The market rewarded mystery, and opium was the most mysterious of all. Medieval Europe, starved of reliable medicine, welcomed it like salvation. The plant that had once been burned in temples now sat in wooden drawers behind shop counters. In small towns, travelling physicians carried pouches of the dark substance as part of their trade. A pinch for pain, a sip for sleep, a few drops for melancholy. These were the promises written on parchment and whispered in the streets. There was a kind of reverence in the way people spoke of it. Patients did not fear it. They thanked it. The poppy sap became part of prayer and prescription alike. What had been sacred in the East was now routine in the West, folded quietly into daily life. The journey from altar to apothecary was complete. The Middle Ages, with their plagues and famines, provided fertile ground for anything that could silence suffering. Death came easily, and pain came sooner. Opium fit perfectly into this world of uncertainty. Monks and herbalists recorded their effects in Latin, describing their power to bring sweet sleep to the troubled. In monasteries, it was stored beside relics, both feared and adored. Those who took it often called the experience divine. To feel the body loosen its grip on pain was to believe in miracles. If the same substance was sold today, it would sit behind pharmacy counters, advertised as a natural sedative for modern stress. By the Renaissance, opium had a new name and a new form. In Italy, alchemists mixed it with wine, herbs, and spices, producing a liquid they called laudanum. The recipe was credited to Paracelsus, a physician who believed that nature held both poison and cure within every substance. His creation spread across Europe like a rumour and became the most fashionable medicine of its time. Bottles of laudanum glowed amber in the light of candlelit pharmacies. It was prescribed for nearly everything colds, insomnia, grief, and even love. Wealthy families kept it on bedside tables. Mothers gave it to restless children. Artists took it to think clearly, and the sick took it to forget. The label promised relief, not warning. The irony of laudanum's success was that it made pain appear manageable. For the first time, suffering could be measured in drops. Doctors called it progress, though they barely understood what they were giving. They had turned the poppy into a commodity, clean and respectable, far from the smoky rituals of its past. There was comfort in its formality, the glass bottle, the neat Latin instructions, the smell of spice hiding the bitterness beneath. Europe was falling in love with order, and laudanum fit perfectly into that illusion. Philosophers wrote of its beauty, poets praised its power to expand the mind, painters described colours that only appeared under its spell. In their search for meaning, they mistook the drug's fog for inspiration. The poppy had learned a new language, one of elegance and intellect. The same resin that once guided spirits in temples now guided pens across paper. Every age finds its excuse. The Renaissance found its roots in art. The spread of opium across the West also carried its quiet corruption. Traders grew rich, apothecaries powerful. The demand for the drug turned the poppy from a flower to an industry. Farmers in the East planted more, driven by profit rather than reverence. What began as trade became dependence between continents. The East supplied the substance, and the West supplied the desire. The pattern that would one day devastate empires was already taking shape, invisible beneath the surface of commerce. Laudanum became the face of that trade. In ornate bottles sealed with wax, it looked harmless, almost luxurious. Its sweetness masked decay. Its promise disguised its cost. The poor bought diluted versions from street vendors. The rich imported refined blends from Italy or England. The distinction between classes dissolved at the bottom of the bottle. All drank from the same flower, and all were bound by the same sleep. The West believed it had mastered the poppy, just as every civilization before it had believed. Physicians wrote proudly of dosage and safety, convinced that measurement meant control, yet they were blind to the quiet dependence building beneath their success. The poppy, patient as ever, waited for its turn to rule them as it had ruled the priests and healers before. What makes this history unsettling is not its violence, but its ease. There was no conquest, no discovery, only acceptance. Opium moved gently through the world, carried by trade winds and curiosity, welcomed wherever pain lived. Humanity did not fight it. Humanity invited it in, offered it a chair, and called it medicine. From deserts to drawing rooms, opium had completed its journey from sacred plant to daily necessity. It was no longer the property of priests but of merchants. Its purpose had changed, but its effect remained the same. The flower's next transformation would not be quiet. It would shake nations, and for the first time, the cost would no longer be measured in dreams but in blood. In Victorian homes, bottles of laudanum stood beside the Bible and the family photographs. The liquid gleamed amber in the light, calm and familiar, a comfort as ordinary as tea. Women poured it by the spoonful into porcelain cups, stirred it into water, and swallowed it without hesitation. It was prescribed for sleepless nights, anxious thoughts, and the dull ache of unending routine. The advertisements called it the friend of the weary, a phrase that promised both virtue and relief. It was medicine, it was fashion, and it was escape. It is almost absurd that something sold as peace in a bottle was slowly draining the life from those who trusted it most. Doctors prescribed laudanum for everything. Coughs, nerves, melancholy, toothaches, even heartbreak. There was no ailment it could not soothe. The bottle became a symbol of modern care, proof that the age of science had triumphed over pain. Apothecaries displayed it proudly in their windows, each label printed with fine lettering and elegant promises. There were no warnings, only elegance. The dosage depended on the doctor's mood or the patient's purse. Mothers mixed drops into milk for restless infants. Husbands took it before bed to silence the weight of long days. It was sold in every city, on every street, and to every class. The culture of restraint that defined Victorian morality did not extend to medicine. Respectable women hid their bottles behind lace curtains, not because it was shameful, but because it was private. Addiction was a word reserved for the poor, not for the refined. The upper class called it nerves, and doctors nodded knowingly, prescribing more. Society did not question their dependence, it romanticized it. The woman who fainted gracefully, the poet who spoke of dreams, the gentleman who stared into nothing, all were quietly tethered to the same amber liquid. Factories produced laudanum by the gallon. The demand was endless, the profits immense. Advertisements filled newspapers, promising rest, beauty, and relief from every discomfort. The irony was striking. An empire that preached discipline and moderation survived on its own addiction. Behind every polished advertisement was a factory where workers inhaled fumes until their hands trembled. They called it progress, and progress required sacrifice. If the same product existed today, it would likely be sold under bright packaging as a wellness elixir, praised for helping people unwind naturally. The effects were slow but unmistakable. Women grew pale, their pupils pinpricks of calm delirium. They spent hours in quiet rooms, staring at nothing, their minds wrapped in a fog they mistook for serenity. Husbands praised their gentleness, not realizing it was the drug that made them docile. Poets wrote of distant worlds and exquisite pain, their genius fueled by addiction they refused to name. The empire's art and literature glowed with the fever of opium, though no one dared to speak of it. Pharmacies became the true temples of the age. Behind their counters, clerks poured and measured without question. The more patients came, the more they sold, and the more society believed in its cure. Newspapers published letters from grateful customers who claimed laudanum had restored their sanity, calmed their children, and saved their marriages. They called it a miracle. No one noticed the bodies quietly piling behind that miracle, the women who wasted away in their beds, the infants who never woke, the men who drifted into silence and never returned. The price of laudanum was low enough for everyone to afford, which made it both democratic and deadly. The poor bought diluted versions from street stalls, unaware of the difference. They, too, found comfort in the drug's quiet embrace. It was one of the few luxuries they shared with the rich. Pain made no distinction between classes, and neither did opium. In that sense, it was the great equalizer of the age. There is something disturbingly human about how easily suffering justifies its own poison. Addiction did not arrive with a scream, but with a sigh. Those who took laudanum every night simply forgot what it felt like to live without it. Days blurred, appetite faded, and emotions dulled into a steady hum. The drug promised calm, and it delivered by stripping away everything else. Society mistook that emptiness for grace, to be composed, to be quiet, to endure without complaint. These were the virtues of the Victorian ideal. Laudanum merely made them possible. Even children were not spared. Doctors prescribed drops of the same solution to soothe colic or fever. The infant slept deeply, sometimes too deeply. Parents called it mercy. The connection between these deaths and the medicine went unnoticed or ignored. After all, it was the same bottle that rested on every respectable mantelpiece. To question it was to question civilization itself. The empire that ruled half the world could not rule its own appetite. Laudanum was both its pride and its weakness. Behind the order and cleanliness of Victorian life, behind the polished manners and moral codes, there pulsed a quiet dependency that no one wanted to name. The same drug that dulled the pain of childbirth also dulled the conscience of a nation. Every sip was an act of faith, in science, in progress, in control. But faith, once misplaced, becomes surrender. The Victorians did not worship gods of stone or fire. They worshipped comfort. Opium, dressed as medicine, became their offering and their reward. The story of laudanum's rise is not simply about addiction. It is about trust. Trust in authority, in progress, and in appearances. The label said medicine, and that was enough. The empire's belief in order blinded it to decay. The bottle that sat quietly beside the Bible did not only soothe the body, it defined the moral shape of an entire society. Laudanum's popularity turned the poppy from a remedy into a ritual. It soothed a nation that prided itself on restraint while quietly unravelling it from within. The illusion of safety would not last forever, for soon the darkness beneath the glass would begin to show its teeth. The glow that once surrounded laudanum began to fade. What had seemed gentle and safe now revealed its cruelty. Patients found themselves unable to sleep without it, unable to face the day without another dose. The body learned its rhythm, demanding more with every week. The hands that once poured careful drops began to shake as the spoon grew heavier. Addiction did not announce itself with alarm. It arrived quietly, disguised as need, whispering that one more sip would bring the peace that always slipped away. It is grimly ironic that the medicine meant to calm the mind was the very thing unravelling it. Doctors did not see the danger. Their trust in science blinded them. They saw patients return for stronger doses and blamed weak nerves, not the drug. When women grew pale and trembling, they called it hysteria. When men collapsed, they said exhaustion. The prescriptions continued, written with calm certainty. Apothecaries filled them without question. Business was good, and good business rarely invites reflection. The dark side of progress was unfolding behind counters and curtains, hidden beneath the same polite silence that had built the empire. The victims were everywhere and invisible. Housewives who began with a few drops for sleepless nights found themselves needing whole bottles. Gentlemen who took it for pain discovered they could not think without it. Artists described visions that blurred into nightmares. The drug offered the illusion of control even as it stripped it away. If such dependence happened today, it would be wrapped in the language of wellness, rebranded as stress management and sold with pastel labels. The methods change. The hunger does not. The first death shocked no one. In a time when life itself was uncertain, death was routine. A sudden passing from nervous failure or weakness of the heart raised little alarm. Newspapers printed obituaries filled with grace and euphemism. The truth lay buried with the bodies. Some overdosed by mistake, others by despair. It was difficult to tell the difference, and easier not to ask. Victorian restraint demanded composure even in grief. The same substance that caused the tragedy was often used to endure it. The pattern grew clear only to those who looked too closely. Doctors noticed that the patients they tried to cure returned again and again. Weaker each time, they reduced the doses, but it was never enough. The craving had already taken root. They saw tremors, hallucinations, and slow madness, yet still refused to call it what it was. To admit addiction would have been to confess ignorance. Pride is a powerful anesthetic. In quiet bedrooms across the empire, suffering changed shape. Pain was no longer sharp or immediate, it became fog, a dullness that spread through every thought. The line between healing and harm vanished. Some wrote that laudanum made life bearable, others admitted it made life disappear. The difference was only time. Every sip promised escape, but escape became the only thing left to pursue. The empire was filled with people asleep with their eyes open. Manufacturers began altering their formulas to make the product more effective. The concentration increased, the danger followed. Advertisements grew louder even as the warnings were ignored. For mothers, children, and the delicate one label read, as though purity could be printed in ink. The more respectable the bottle looked, the deadlier its contents became. I find it chilling that appearance was trusted more than truth, as if elegance could cancel poison. Some reformers tried to speak out. Physicians wrote cautious letters to journals, noting the strange dependence among their patients. They were met with indifference or scorn. To question the safety of laudanum was to challenge an entire system built on convenience and profit. The government, dependent on taxes from the opium trade abroad, had no interest in exposing its domestic cost. Silence became policy, and denial a national virtue. The deaths grew harder to ignore. Entire households fell ill at once, their bottles still half full. Inquests were held, but the verdicts were gentle. Accidental overdose, carelessness, misfortune, never addiction. It was easier to mourn than to understand. Families replaced their loss with ritual and respectability. The bottles remained on the shelves, the prescriptions renewed, and the cycle resumed. The deeper tragedy was not in the deaths, but in the normalization. Pain had become something to be erased, not endured. Opium provided that erasure, and society embraced it without shame. Every era creates its own blind spots, and the Victorians was comfort. They mistook numbness for strength and dependency for refinement. The very qualities they admired, calmness, composure, reserve, were often nothing more than the drug's quiet dominion. The more laudanum spread, the less anyone noticed its presence. It became part of the scenery, like wallpaper or the ticking of a clock. Those who suffered did so quietly, blending into the rhythm of a world that preferred not to see. The empire's perfection depended on forgetting its flaws, and opium made forgetting effortless. By the time the first serious studies appeared, the damage was irreversible. Doctors described opium habituation, a phrase too delicate for the devastation it implied. It was not a scandal yet. Scandals require outrage, and the Victorians had none to spare. The drug that had shaped their daily lives had also shaped their silence. The myth of control persisted even as the evidence grew. Addiction was seen as moral weakness, not chemical enslavement. The sufferers were blamed for indulgence instead of being treated for dependence. Society congratulated itself for restraint while drowning in its own denial. The poppy had conquered an empire without a single battle, using only patience and need. The truth was simple and devastating. The miracle medicine had become a parasite. It fed on the very structure of civilization, its order, its pride, its fear of pain. The more people relied on it, the weaker they became. What had begun as progress was now quietly eating its way through the heart of the empire. The comfort once promised by laudanum had turned into captivity. Dependence spread like a quiet plague, hidden behind curtains and polite words. The realization was coming, slow and inevitable, and when it arrived, it would no longer be possible to pretend that the empire's calm was anything but carefully managed decay. The most dangerous change was not in the body but in the mind. Those who once took opium to dull pain began to use it to dull thought. The world seemed easier when softened by its haze. Disappointment shrank, fear dissolved, and guilt became distant. The drug not only silences suffering, it silences conscience. Within its calm, there was no urgency, no remorse, no sense of wrong or right. The mind floated above reality like smoke above fire, detached and indifferent. It is almost darkly humorous that people once mistook numbness for enlightenment. For the first time, doctors themselves began to surrender to the same comfort they prescribed. The men who had spent their lives measuring doses started to pour for themselves. Their reasoning was simple. They were tired, overworked, deserving of rest. A few drops after long hours became routine. Soon, the same pens that wrote prescriptions trembled, not from fatigue but dependence. The healer and the patient had become reflections of each other, bound by the same quiet need. Hospitals smelled faintly of laudanum, not from the sick but from those who cared for them. In their journals, some physicians confessed to the relief it brought. The drug made their thoughts slower, their worries distant, their failures tolerable. They called it clarity, but it was only absence. The profession that had once sworn to relieve suffering was learning to share in it. The more they used, the less they saw. It was easier to dull sympathy than to feel it. The cries of the ill became easier to ignore when one's own mind was comfortably blurred. The poppy had conquered compassion, and no one noticed. The same detachment spread through society. artists, priests, and scholars, all drawn by the promise of escape, began to live half inside the fog. To some, it felt like elevation, a higher understanding untouched by ordinary emotion. In truth, it was erosion. The drug stripped away empathy first, then curiosity, then will. The empire still moved, but without conviction. Its people performed their duties mechanically, as though life were a play performed for no audience. If this condition existed today, it might be called burnout, an exhaustion disguised as calm, managed with pills instead of poppies. Opium had become a mirror for the human need to forget. Those who suffered used it to erase pain, and those who sinned used it to erase guilt. The distinction between medicine and indulgence no longer mattered. The same drop that silenced agony could silence doubt. A soldier who could not sleep took it and dreamed of peace. A mother who had lost her child took it and felt nothing at all. The absence of pain was mistaken for healing, the absence of feeling for strength. The doctors noticed but refused to condemn. To do so would have meant condemning themselves. They continued to speak of opium in the language of science, measured, detached, respectable. They recorded symptoms, noted outcomes, and ignored morality. The drug was no longer just in the body. It had entered the culture, shaping thought itself. Every generation believes it can manage its own vices, and every generation is wrong. Those who lived through the haze of opium described it as a half-life. Food lost its taste, colours faded, but the silence was intoxicating. People began to prefer stillness to joy, numbness to clarity. The drug taught them that peace required only surrender. The idea spread beyond medicine into philosophy and art. Writers called it transcendence. They built entire movements on the illusion that detachment was wisdom. It was easier to dream than to act, easier to imagine virtue than to live it. In parlours and study rooms, conversations drifted into abstraction. The empire prided itself on logic and progress, yet its thinkers floated through their arguments like ghosts. They debated morality while slowly losing it. What opium offered was not inspiration but escape, from guilt, from conflict, from choice. The flower had learned the one truth of civilization: people will forgive anything that feels like peace. Something is haunting about how easily intelligence can justify its own surrender. The line between healing and indulgence dissolved completely. To be medicated was no longer shameful but fashionable. A calm face, a steady voice, and an untroubled heart became signs of refinement. Society celebrated the very symptoms of addiction as virtues of composure. The more distant people grew from emotion, the more they were praised for grace. The poppy had not only numbed pain, it had rewritten morality. Even the language changed. Doctors stopped speaking of illness and began speaking of comfort. Philosophers spoke of detachment as a noble state. The idea of care turned inward, transforming into self-absorption. Pain was no longer something to confront but to dissolve. The empire's spirit followed the same path as its medicine, measured, elegant, and utterly hollow. Those who tried to resist found themselves isolated. To live fully, to feel sharply, was seen as vulgar. The new virtue was composure, and opium made it possible. What had begun as healing had become a way of living without consequence. The drug did not simply treat suffering, it redefined what it meant to be human. The silence it created was seductive. No wars of conscience, no outbursts of grief, no inconvenient passions, just a steady calm spreading through every class and every home. The empire mistook this stillness for stability, unaware that it was the calm of decay, a society that cannot feel, cannot change. By the time the danger was recognized, the habit was already woven into the structure of life. Doctors who had once sworn to heal had forgotten what healing meant. Writers who had once sought truth found beauty in oblivion. Ordinary people drifted through days without memory or remorse. The empire's great strength, its discipline, had become its greatest weakness. Opium had moved beyond the body and into the soul. It not only dulled pain, but also erased the will to resist it. The calm that once felt divine had become suffocating, and yet no one wanted to wake. The moment of reckoning was coming, carried by smoke and silence, and when it arrived, the cost would no longer be hidden behind polite denial. The sea carried many things to China: tea, silk, silver, and hidden